Hey, welcome to the Office of Undergraduate Research Education Series. Today's presentation is The Craft of a Research Question, and our speaker is Dr. Jeff Bates. This is a virtual event, and we are recording it, so it will be on demand. We ask that you please mute yourself and turn off your camera to ensure the best experience. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature, or you can unmute yourself when you're invited by the speaker. The mission of the Office of Undergraduate Research is to facilitate and promote undergraduate, student, faculty collaborative research and creative works in all disciplines throughout the University of Utah campus. And this is the event evaluation. We encourage everyone to complete this after the presentation, but we wanted to remind the UROP and the early exploration scholars that they must complete this evaluation in order to receive credit for attending the event. And we'd like to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. And I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jeff Bates, who is an assistant professor in material science and engineering. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Bates.
Cool, thank you, Shelley. So here's my opening slide, but thank you all for being here. I'm excited to share this with you. It's something that I've had to learn over many years, so I'm hoping to kind of decrease the learning curve for you today. I would love it if you have questions, please feel free to ask at any time. Like Shelley said, you can put them in the chat if you want, or if it's something that's very relevant to what I'm talking about at the moment, just go ahead and raise your hand and we can call on you and get your question answered. So we're going to be talking about the craft of a research question today. So here's just a quick introduction. So we're going to understand the significance of a research question, develop techniques for crafting effective research questions, gain the tools for developing research questions, and relate research questions to the project scope and objectives. So I have been a professor at the University of Utah since 2014. I started off as a teaching faculty member. And so while I was a teaching faculty member, I have two startup companies. And so we were always formulating research questions to be able to help people develop and help companies develop new materials for their needs. So I just kind of wanted to base this off some of the stuff that I've learned throughout those years and then now in the research side. So first of all, understanding the significance of a research question. I guess so when we talk about the significance, I mean, that word means what does it mean? But I think that when I think about the significance of a research question, I'm thinking is this something that's important enough to answer? Or is this something that's relevant to people? Or what would be the impact on the scientific community, on society, on any, whatever your research is related to, what would that impact be on that specific field? So that's kind of what we're going to go through for the first little bit, just to understand what these questions mean and how to write questions that are going to be impactful and significant. So this is kind of like my do this or the opposite. This is what it looks like. So first of all, the research questions guide the focus of your research. They provide a framework for inquiry. This is especially useful. So when you write a UROP proposal, for example, you're going to have here is the project that I'm proposing for 16 weeks. And so everything that you address in that should essentially be related to your research questions that you have. And so that way, when you say, I'm going to analyze my data, I'm going to use these methods because this was my research question. So I need to use these methods so I can, and I need to do these experiments or these studies or whatever to be able to answer these specific research questions. So if you look at the opposite, I always like to look at the opposite and say, okay, if we don't do this, what's going to happen? So I have done the opposite before. Even with UROP projects, I had some students at the beginning of my career that I felt like some of their stuff was directionless exploration, and they got ambiguous results. And they got results that were meaningful, but we had to kind of derive the meaning at the end of the project. So, oh, this is what we found, and oh, actually, this was probably the question that we were going to be answering all along. So I think it's important to kind of front load some of this work, before you apply for any project or a grant or whatever. I just earlier this week I gave a lecture at Lassonde about writing grant proposals for funding your small businesses. So if you are interested in doing that and how do you formulate research questions for that, I'm happy to answer questions related to that as well. All right, so how do you craft research questions? I'm going to start off with a case study. So I'm going to go through this first section with a case study because I think it's easiest to see, like, if we talk about like a real world thing, and hopefully you can see the relevance and application to what you're doing. While I'm doing this, and obviously my background is engineering and science. If your background is like, if your major is not in those, please feel free to chime in. Like if you have ideas, things that have worked for you, of maybe guidance that people have shared with you, or if you're just like, wow, I just don't quite understand this all the way. How do you think this could be applicable to what I'm trying to do? Then I'm happy to stop for a second and discuss that. So first of all, you have to define the problem that you're trying to solve. So in this, so this is actually a UROC project that I have a student working on right now. So it's his current project. And I mean, there's a lot of questions that we could ask, but like we needed to define the problem so that we could understand what we were trying to do. So we actually backed this problem really far out. And we said, if we were going to solve a problem in 3D printing, for example, we could say, like, what are some potential applications? So we did a deep dive into the research to see like just what are some applications for it. And we did discover that like chemical sensing in the body and then drug release in the body were some things that would be relevant. And so that's like, zooming all the way out, not his project, but like our entire, like our research program in my research group. One of them, we have 3 different research programs in my research group, and this is like, the focus of the entire program. So what we're breaking it down to is this student specifically. So as if I'm the student, my research group is working on soft robotic devices, and I want to do a UROC project that fits within the scope of their project. So that's kind of the problem that he's trying to solve. It's, it's a totally fine problem to solve. And so I think he wants to do something that's relevant. So let's kind of bring it back into this. So what is the problem you need to solve? So any of these could be the problem, but so this is the question that you would ask yourself. So these are all questions you would ask. How do you craft a research question? What's the problem you have that you're trying to solve? So in his case, the problem could be that the materials don't 3D print very easily. They're too wet, and lots of 3D printers actually, you'll avoid the warranty on them if you print your own materials. So you're kind of constrained to what they have, but we don't really like what any of these other companies have. We want to print our own materials, that we make our own plastic polymer inks. So then the next one is the materials don't respond the way that they need to. So where we're making chemical sensors that also deliver drugs, we want them to be, it's called stimuli responsive. So in the presence of certain chemicals, and depending on the concentration of those chemicals, they will shrink or swell. So some people call these smart materials. I don't really call them smart materials because they just do what you program, not program, but like what they're intended to do. So these are, they're intended to leverage the different ions in solution, and depending on what's there, they'll shrink or they'll swell. So in this case, I don't think we can find any inks that are stimuli responsive hydrogels. So that's our second question. The third one is the 3D printed soft robotic doesn't work. So that is a problem we're trying to solve. And then our group has only done preliminary work. So, I said any of these could be the problem. I wrote them all in here because they're all the problem. So we're going to take as our case study, let's say that the problem is that the material just won't print. So if you want to understand the significance of the problem, you need to do a deep dive to understand the following. And this is going to be a literature search. So I'll talk to you about how to do a literature search in just a minute. But it's really important to learn this skill. I mean, I would say like, I mean, I don't know what fields you're all going to be going into, but I think that, you know, as long as you can have like a nice substantiated motive for doing the things that you're doing, I think, you know, a literature search is going to help significantly there. So these are like 5 of the questions that you would ask yourself and probably write down on a piece of paper or on a Word document or something, to help you just kind of get started with this. So I always kind of write questions like this. In fact, you can just use these exact questions if you want. But so I always use these questions. And so then what I do is I go to the literature and I just copy and paste a bunch of links. And then as I read them, I copy and paste aspects of those papers that worked really well. And then I kind of have a framework. Specifically, I'm trying to answer these questions. And so maybe I'm using the same publication through, for 3 or 4 of these. But I'm able to draw the specific answer to those questions into each question. So the first one is what has been done before, because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. And so you just want to see like, what have other people been doing? And then you want to build off of that work. And so to understand this, you kind of have to say, okay, what are the oldest papers out there in the field about this? So that's kind of laying the groundwork. And you'll see that all of the newest papers tend to cite those oldest papers, or if they're like monumental, pivotal types of papers that are out there. And they'll be pretty easy to find because you'll see a lot of people are citing those papers. So anyway, so I would look at that, like the oldest, and then maybe some like groundwork types of publications. But then I always look at the ones that have been published in the last year or two. I mean, a lot of papers have been published already in 2024. We've already published a paper in 2024. So this is really important because then you'll know like what's the current state of the art, what's happening right now, and are you, competing with somebody? There's nothing wrong with competing with somebody, like nothing wrong at all. But it's nice to see what's happening right now. So that if you're going to work on a project, like if it's a grant proposal or a UROP project, and you happen, like your application happens to go to somebody who is also an expert in that field, and they'll be like, well, wait a minute, I'm going to poke holes in everything that you're doing because all these papers just came out. So just kind of be aware. You don't need to know every single thing that was done before, but I would say, get a good feel for that. The second are what are some monumental accomplishments that have already been done? And those are like those monumental works. So let's see, what are some outstanding questions that have not yet been addressed? So what I do when I'm reading all of the publications is I don't necessarily poke holes in their papers, but like I kind of ask myself questions. So I always have a separate document off to the side that's not this one that I'm working on right here, but one off to the side where I just kind of ask questions like, oh, what was the composition of these 3D printed inks that they used? Or, that can be used, or have people used stimuli responsive hydrogels to 3D print before. So the outstanding questions. So I usually, the more I read, the more questions I have, but then I also go through as I read them, I just use the strike through. So I know that I asked that question already, but it's been answered by somebody else. And if it's significant enough, then you'll just maybe want to write down what the answers were and where to direct yourself to those answers. So anyway, so I always have like these nice questions, and then they keep building, and then I whittle them down, and I still have like way too many questions that one specific project would cover, but that's kind of where I start getting my scientific questions, my research questions. So another thing that you should be looking at, and lots of times they'll say this, they'll say, well, the limitations of this project are X, Y, and Z. Or they'll say, we're going to work on this project because this has not been done before, or this is the first time this has been done, or we're kind of building up whatever. So look at the limitations of the research, and then it's not, you can have a nice list of those, but then like if those have been solved by other people, you can also scratch those off. So you just kind of want to have a nice little roadmap of where you've been with your learning and where you need to go with your research. So I also list, like in future directions, there's lots of papers will have a future directions section. That's a really good place to find limitations, or to know like what would be the next step of this project. And so sometimes you can just compile a nice list of future directions as well, and then see if any of those speaks to you or kind of matches the research group that you're working with or the research project that you're trying to propose. And so that will lead us to, so whatever hasn't been answered and whatever hasn't been scratched through, what are some exciting opportunities in this field? And you'll see that there are way too many exciting opportunities and you will not know where to start. So that's kind of where you need to figure that out. But so notes on literature search. So I always use Google Scholar. I know other people use PubMed. Well, actually, so if I use Google Scholar, I only ever look at like the NCBI PubMed types of publications for healthcare stuff that I do. But so Google Scholar, PubMed, JSTOR, there are other searchable databases that you can use. But just start with some searchable database. Google Scholar tends to have everything on it. So I like that. And then you can filter out patents if you don't want those to appear, or only patents if you just want to see those. You can also filter out by year. So you can look and see like anything that's like super old. You can say, okay, not, from the 1930s, but you can't choose like that specifically, but you can say within the last year, so 2024, 2023. So I use those. One of the things, so there are different types of articles that you can read. You probably already know about a lot of them, but there are like research articles, there are review articles, and there are other types of articles as well. What review articles do is they put many papers into context, and so that context will usually be given in the title of the paper. And so it'll give you a really quick review of all the different research groups and what they're working on. And a lot of times people will publish review articles on the same topic, but you'll see that they're published a few years apart from each other. So I would say, kind of look at the newest review articles because they're going to cover the most landscape. But review articles are a good place to start, but they're not the end of information. So you'll probably just kind of get a quick paragraph, or maybe, they're not going to do like very much of an analysis or go into the deep parts of the project that they worked on. But you'll see what they're citing. So I always like, whether it's a review article or a research article, when somebody makes a statement in these articles and then you see a citation next to it, I actually go and read what the citation is talking about. So I actually go to that paper as well. Really quickly, you can also, like the Marriott Library has subscribed to a lot of different journals. And you probably know this, but I'm just telling you in case you don't. So if you're off campus, you can log in as an off-campus user and you'll have access to all of it. So you won't have all the paywalls that you sometimes get when you go to Google Scholar. But anyway, so we have those. So then I always highlight the interesting and applicable parts because a lot of times you'll see that the majority of the paper is not even remotely relevant to what you're talking about, or it's not providing useful information. So I just highlight the parts that are going to be useful to what I'm talking about. And I said this already, go to the citations page and see what articles they're citing, read those articles as well, and use those as the starting point to look at their methods and conclusions. Because when you're asking research questions, lots of times there's a method that you're trying to find the answer to as well. So that's where that kind of comes into play. So let's see. There we go. So here's how I read published articles. I actually rarely read the entire thing because lots of times I don't need all of that information and it puts me to sleep, or it's like, wow, it's too overwhelming and you have to take a brain break or something. So I always read the title. Is the title gonna, does it sound like it's gonna give me something that's going to be useful? So great. Let's say that it does. Then I read the abstract. And sometimes like, wow, I have all the information that I need right there in the abstract. I probably don't need to read much more of the paper. But I always read the conclusion. So I always read title, abstract, conclusions. The conclusions are just going to take the abstract and go into a little bit more depth to tell you, like, here are some of the experiments that we ran, and these are the conclusions that we got from them. So those are the three things that I always read for every single article. So if I still have some questions and I want to understand more of what they did because it's going to be relevant to what I am doing or what I'm proposing, then I will look at the discussion. That's where they're going to discuss the results. Sometimes it's listed as results and discussion. Sometimes it's just listed as a discussion. So I go to the discussion and it's okay, that's where they're analyzing the data and comparing it to what other people have done. And so sometimes I'll see things in there like, oh, well, they're comparing their work to this other paper right here. So that's another place to find additional citations. Sometimes I'll read the introduction because the introduction is kind of like a mini literature review. I mean, it is not kind of, it is a mini literature review. And so they're going to set the framework for the study that they've been working on. And so they're going to put it into the context of things that have been published, because they want to say, okay, all these things were published. We found these knowledge gaps or limitations or whatever, however they describe it. We still had these questions, so therefore the focus of this study is going to be this. And so they'll give you, a couple of things. Sometimes they're written in the form of research questions. But the introduction can be a very good place to go. Sometimes I'll do the results because those are really relevant to what I'm specifically looking for, especially when I'm developing a method for something. I'm just like, okay, I already know what the method is that I would do, but what results did they get and how can I compare my results to their results? And then sometimes the last one that I would consider is materials and methods. And that's really only if I want to do the same type of testing that they did, or I want to get more information like, okay, I ran this test, but I want to analyze it a different way. So how did they analyze theirs? So that's kind of the order. So if I read an entire paper, that's the order that I would read the paper in. I'm not saying that you have to read the papers in that order, but this is just what I'm like, this is what I always tell my students also. I'm like, okay, start with the title, abstract, and conclusions. I would say the majority of the time you've pretty much gotten the information you need from there, but lots of times you'll need, more depth. And so that's when you would read the other ones. All right. So when we ask the question, what has been done before? So if we look at our case study of just 3D printing, there are lots of things that have been done in 3D printing. So material development. So we're trying to leverage the stimuli response. So what other research groups have done that? Looking at different 3D printing techniques. So SLA, DLP, FDM, FF. So the last two are extrusion-based. DLP is digital light processing, and SLA is, oh, I forgot what it is, but stereolithography, sorry. So anyway, so there are lots of different kinds of 3D printers, but bottom line, these are the ones that we have access to in my lab. So we kind of wanted to see how, like, what's been done with these these three specific types from other people. Also multi-material printing. So in our case, we're trying to make a soft robotic microfluidic device that can detect something and then release a drug in response to the concentration that it detects. And so that would require multi-materials. Sometimes it's the same type of material, but it's just some different properties. So anyway, I'm saying here complex constructs with different properties. There have been many papers published in biomedical applications, specifically tissue scaffolds, drug delivery, sensors, and many other things. And then I always want to see what are the challenges and future directions. And I say here that it deserves its own slide. So here we go, challenges and future directions. So in our case, optimization of printing parameters, characterization of the stimuli response, scalability of processes, which maybe is important, but maybe not. It just depends on what your research group is doing. In my research group, we don't really care that much about that one. But integration of functional components, new applications and methods, low print resolution, low print fidelity. So these are some of the recurring themes that came up in, a literature search of like 100 papers on 3D printing of hydrogel. So this, a nice little consolidated list of 7. So what has already been done? So our research group has worked on several of these. We've looked at print fidelity, print resolution, stimuli response, and multi-material constructs. So when you're asking what has been done before, many times it's in the context of what are other researchers doing. But if you're doing a UROP project or a project with a faculty member, you'll want to know what your research group is doing also, because you're going to want to, I would suggest that you're going to want to build your work on the work of other people. There are probably graduate students that have worked on this project. And so they'll be able to say, okay, I've gotten it to this point, I'm working on this, but we're branching this project off into your UROP project or whatever your project is. So, these are the things that we worked on in my lab. So ask your research group, ask your faculty mentor, what has your research group been doing? I'm going to pause for just a second because I want to say that I've had students in the past that have come to me and they've said, I want to do a research project and this is the idea that I want to work on. Can you help me with my idea? And I am very happy to do that. But the only risk that you run with that is if the faculty member doesn't have funding for like new projects, then it's going to be hard, like a hard sell. So I would say if you have that idea, it's totally great, but it might be a better fit with Lassonde Studios, for example, because they've got their Get Seated. But you can do that, and I have done that. I've had those as UROP projects before, and so there's nothing wrong with asking. You can always ask. So I'm not saying not to do that, but what I would say is when students come up to me and say they want to do a UROP project, I say that's really great. Or actually, they don't even approach me that way. They say that they want to do research in my lab. So I'm like, okay, well, I always like to do that through UROP. So all of our undergraduate researchers are funded through UROP at the moment. And so I just say, okay, if you're going to do that with, something with me, I want them to come to our research group meetings, for a couple of weeks, a month, whatever. I like to help them with their UROP proposal, kind of give them mentorship and guidance. I like to have them kind of take the lead on it, and then I kind of poke some holes in it and say, hey, you didn't think about this, you didn't think about this. Here's a couple of publications to be looking at. And so, it just kind of helps with some mentorship, so it makes more sense. But also, I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you want to have a UROP project or a research project as an undergraduate student, many times the faculty members just already have something. So be open to that as well. And while it may not be specific to what you want to do, it'll probably teach you many of the skills that will help you do what you want to do. So there are two approaches for getting an undergraduate research project. So one where you have your idea, one where you're asking the faculty member if they have an idea. All right, so then I always ask, like, what are some remaining questions that we had? So in this so first of all, I already talked about this. You will have made a list of your questions as you reviewed the literature, and you will have crossed some of them off because they have already been answered. So what are the limitations? So case study, in our case, material properties, printability and resolution, multifunctionality, biocompatibility and toxicity, stability and durability, interdisciplinary challenges. So we have a lot of issues where, and I'm in this case where my undergrad was in biology and my PhD is in material science and engineering. And there are very few people, I think I found 5 people so far in my life that have that combination of degrees. So it's usually MSc stands for Material Science and Engineering. So MSc and engineering kind of live in a silo, and biology lives in a silo. And so they don't often talk to each other, but they're kind of developing parallel methods. So that's kind of where we've come in. We're like, okay, well, biologists have done this and material scientists have done this, and how can we marry the two things that they've been working on? So those are some of the huge limitations in my field. So I like to frame this, I guess, in a more positive way, instead of saying, okay, this is all the crappy work that's been done out there, or, nobody's asking these questions, so we have all these knowledge gaps, any of that. I just like to, what are some exciting opportunities? And this gives you a chance to say, okay, what is exciting to you? So you have all of these limitations and, questions that you asked that weren't answered, and, consolidate them down into what you think will be the most exciting thing to work on. And then go talk to your faculty mentor and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? And usually when my students hit this point, I'm like, yes, perfect. We landed on the same conclusion. We're now on the same page. You did all of this work, and we are right here ready to develop some really cool questions. So just kind of finalizing the case study. So there are many different types of 3D printing. Some researchers have used the BioX and Luminex, which are 2 of the printers we have in our in our lab. So the specific research questions that this UROP project is addressing is, what changes can we make to the polymer composition to enhance print fidelity? And how does 3D printing change the stimuli response of the material? So 2 very specific questions that would still be like a master's degree, honestly, if you're going to answer these in total depth, but laying the groundwork, you can do a nice mini project with this. The student who's doing this is in his 2nd semester renewal, but he actually did a year of volunteer research with me before he got his UROP project. So he's been able to do a lot of really cool work with this project. So the next set of things, the next learning objective I had, is developing techniques for crafting effective research questions. So you'll want to define the scope of your project. So you kind of have some questions, and like I landed on these nice, beautiful questions. It's like, okay, here we go. This is what we're going to focus on. But those were like at the end of this story that I'm sharing with you right now. So define the scope of your project. So these are some questions to ask yourself. How much time can you dedicate to the project? Like, are you an undergraduate student? Are you working full time? Do you have any extracurricular things? So it's like, what's realistic in your life? What kind of studying, what kind of courses do you have right now? What resources do you have access to? So do you have all the instruments that you need in your lab? And I'm using lab because that's what I have. I know that not all of you have labs. I totally understand that. Some of you do computational stuff. Some of you do social stuff that involves humans. So I completely understand that that's not. So when I talk about resources that you have access to, think about what do you have access to in your specific project? What's the time frame? So if it's a UROC project, it's going to be 1 semester. What is your research group currently doing in this space? What do you think you can contribute? And do you have some specific skills? So I have an undergraduate researcher right now. He's actually not in my department. He's in mechanical engineering, but I specifically reached out to him. I asked a bunch of mechanical engineering professors that I need a really good undergraduate researcher that's very motivated and can help me with, and I gave them the specifications because we're trying to make a mechanical device with some sensors rigged up to something that you would put on a ski and you could take it up to the slopes and you could measure like the coefficient of friction that happens when you're skiing. So I asked three professors of mechanical engineering. They all named the same student. So I reached out to him, and he has the perfect specific skills to help our research group with this project. So techniques for crafting questions. So brainstorming and idea generation, narrowing down broad topics, and refining the questions through literature review, which we talked about literature review already, but let's talk about brainstorming and ideation. So these are rules that I like to live by. So first of all, define the objectives. What are we brainstorming? What's going to be like too far outside of scope? Like how silly do we want to get with this? I think it's really fun to brainstorm with other people. And it's okay if you brainstorm by yourself. Sometimes you can use AI to help you brainstorm some ideas. I do that actually quite often with writing grant proposals. I'll just say, okay, what's the current state of the art of this? Or, if I did this, how would I, what kind of problem would I be solving? Things like that. But anyway, let's say you're going to just brainstorm either by yourself or with somebody else. And you could ask your faculty member or even a grad student or another undergrad to help you with that. But you just, lay down the ground rules at the beginning. What are the objectives? And then I always like to warm up to get the juices flowing. I'm calling it that. Probably sounds kind of gross. But anyway, what I'm just thinking is like, sometimes you get really good ideas, but you just have to throw up some stupid things first. So I always say, we don't have, so like the fifth one, allow crazy ideas. So it's like, okay, well, let's just say pie in the sky, like the absolute craziest thing that we could do, kind of start with those and like, okay, well, now let's kind of put it within the context of something that would actually work. But so generate a high quantity of ideas. So when I do this activity with my students, I teach a class called Materials Innovation every other spring. So I taught it last year, and I said, okay, we're going to do some brainstorming today, and we are going to fill the entire whiteboard. So hopefully everybody's going to have a chance to list many things. If you don't want to list things, then that's okay. But I just want to get, big group discussion going. And it's really fun. They always act really overwhelmed at first, but then they start getting such great ideas. So it's really fun. Then you can build off ideas. You can say, oh, this person said this, but what if we did this? Or what if we added this or whatever? So just kind of unleash this whole concept of just brainstorming and let things go. You're going to get way too many ideas, which is fine because then you're going to narrow down the topics. So you're going to review and kind of organize them into themes. You're going to evaluate your ideas compared to the scope of the project. You'll find that many of your ideas were very far outside of the scope of your project. Then you'll prioritize them and say, okay, well, actually, if we're to do this, this is my top choice, second choice, third choice. So combine and consolidate, because you'll see a lot of them kind of have similar themes or have things that could kind of play off each other or work well together. Then refine your ideas and make a decision for how you're going to proceed. So then you have your just refining the research questions. So apply the ideas that you created to your research scope and objectives and rewrite the questions in a way that satisfies the project objectives. And that's what I showed you in that slide at the end of the last section. So then the next part is gaining the tools for developing research questions. So there are two methods. So one of them is population. So it describes the population or patient group being studied. is, we're not always looking at population stuff, but this is where, like in my case, we don't look at population, but what are some things that we kind of look at, like the lay of the land? Intervention, so specifies the intervention of exposure being considered. Comparison identifies identifies the alternative or control group or compares different interventions or exposures, and outcome defines the outcome or endpoint of interest. So that's the PICO method. Then the other one is called the SPICE method. So it describes the context or environment in which the study takes place. Perspective considers the viewpoint or perspective from which the research questions is framed. This is a really important part because a lot of the stuff that I do, we could ask it from a physics perspective, we could ask it from a biology perspective, from a materials engineering perspective, from a chemistry perspective. So the way that you ask your questions and the perspective is really going to make a huge difference in the way you ask it, in the outcome and actually what your project is going to be. So intervention, similar to the intervention component of PICO, this specifies the intervention of or exposure being examined. Comparisons, so you're going to compare the components in PICO, identifying control alternatives and control groups. Evaluation specifies the outcome or endpoint of interest. So those are just like a couple of methods. But so how do you, so let's see, relate research questions to the project scope and objectives. So how do you align them with the scope? So you put the scope of the project in one column, you put the questions in another column, you remove the questions that are outside of the scope of the project. And what questions you have left, that's your starting point. They may not be like totally refined questions, but they will be questions that will be relevant to the scope. So here's kind of, well, actually, so first of all, the undergraduate component of this, so sorry, the constraint of the project. So this is kind of helping with your scope, but I use this for AI. So so the constraint, you're an undergraduate 16-week project, you'll have the questions that you've developed, you'll talk about the scope of your project, and then you'll have resources, tools, chemicals, anything else. So this is how can you use AI to refine your research questions. So I said, feed it a lot of information in the prompt. When I get really good results from AI, it's because I have a prompt that's like 3 pages long. So I just kind of copy and paste all of my ideas into this, and I say, okay, here's my constraint, and develop the, give me ideas for an undergraduate research project that would last for 16 weeks. Here are the research questions that we've identified. Here's kind of where we want to constrain the project, saying it should start here and should kind of end here. We have access to these things. And so it's pretty good at giving you something. So here is my example of an AI generated question. So here's my prompt. This is one of the smaller prompts that I have, but craft 4 research questions for a junior in college studying materials science and engineering who will be working on a 16-week research project where we're trying to solve problems we have had with 3D printing hydrogel materials, and our research questions are: how does the viscosity of the pre-polymerized solution? Oh, how does the viscosity? Oh, well, that's not even a complete question. But anyway, what additives can be added to enhance the polymerization reaction? What's the effect of the light source? So I had all these things, and then here are some examples. So it gave me my 4 research questions. They are significantly longer than I wanted them to be. And we didn't really want 4. I think if you're going to do a UROP project, you only want probably 2. Like maybe 3 would be a push, but I think that 2 is definitely plenty. So this is kind of, you can see the questions that it gave me if I was going to ask this as a question. And so I edited them down to something I thought was a little bit more appropriate. So how does the viscosity impact the printability of hydrogel-based materials in 3D printing for soft robotics? What applications can be incorporated to enhance the polymerization and improve the mechanical properties? What is the influence of UV light on 3D printing? How does it affect print resolution, mechanical properties, and cross-linking density? So that's kind of like the end of like, here's my advice for this, but here are some concluding thoughts, which were some questions that were given to me that I loved. And so I just wanted to have them like totally verbatim here. But I wanted you to know that coming up with research questions is difficult. And it's difficult for me. I struggle with them all the time. And that's why I go walk my dog. And that's why I get like 20,000 steps every day. I have a Fitbit. But because it is difficult. Like you spend all this time kind of reading literature and talking to people and brainstorming and all of that stuff. But sometimes you have to take a step away from it. Like your brain just needs a second to process it. And I have a baby who, well, I shouldn't call him a baby. He's 19 months old, so whatever that means. But so a toddler. And he'll wake up in the middle of the night sometimes. And so I walk him around the house and I get my best ideas walking around the house with this little baby. So I'm not saying you should do that. And I'm not saying you need to go out and walk your dog or anything like that. But sometimes the ideas and the questions or whatever will come to you. And so I just always text my email at work. So just on my phone, I'm like, oh, I'm at Lagoon. Oh, I have this really cool research question. So I send it off to my email and I can think about it later. But so, navigating this difficulty, I think that the biggest thing is people are available to help you. So there are people, I don't want to overcommit the Office of Undergraduate Research, but I'm pretty certain that they are going to be very happy to help you. But your faculty mentor is also happy to help you. Like, I choose to work with undergraduate students because I like helping them. And so I feel committed. I want them to be successful. I don't want it to be difficult for them. So I always tell all of my students, whether they're grad students or undergrads, as soon as you hit a roadblock, come talk to me. We'll talk through this, make it work. So what processes would you recommend when you're unable to come up with the question? I would use AI, actually. It's going to be a good starting point. It'll give you some really stupid stuff. So it'll tell you, so essentially you'll be like, okay, I gave it a prompt. It gave me something that I think is totally bogus. But that's something that you now know, okay, I don't want to do that, but it kind of helps you. It's almost like a good brainstorming tool in that way, because then you can say, okay, well, it gave me this, but actually I'm thinking this might work better. So in addition to difficulty, how do you navigate it emotionally when it might be frustrating? Oh my goodness, this happens all the time. And I'm just going to tell you, you are not alone. So, I mean, that doesn't really help that much, because when you're in it, you're like, oh, well, it's nice that I'm not alone, but but I would just say definitely rely on people. So you've got a network of people that are committed to helping you navigate your undergraduate research and your undergraduate career. So please reach out to people, and it could be friends and family. Maybe you have somebody that kind of works in your field, or has studied the same type of thing, and maybe they'll have some really good insights. Okay, now this happens all the time. Have you ever experienced other questions emerging as you were doing data collection? Absolutely. And that's because I always keep a list of all those questions kind of off to the side. So how do I navigate when there are other questions emerging, prioritizing the question for the project and questions that could be for future research? So that's just really, you say, okay, here's the scope. Like in one of my research programs, it's all about microplastics. So in my ideal world, so it's like my long-term research goal is we have plastics that don't turn into microplastics. They're recyclable, they're biodegradable, and our bodies can just process them, and that's totally fine. And so like I could ask questions relevant to that, but that we are decades away from getting to my research goal. So what I do is I break this into like digestible pieces. I say, okay, where are we right now? I want to get here. What are the questions that lead me to the next step? And those would be the priority that I have. Sometimes I have like multiple research questions that would be the next step. So you kind of break those into different projects that have like a similar end point, like 20 years down the road, but their question, and I know that you're probably not all going to be researchers, but what I'm saying is you can kind of just say, okay, what would be the next logical step in this? The relationship between a research question and a thesis. I think that the research question, this is my opinion, the research questions are going to drive what your thesis is. You say, I have these questions, this is my statement that I'm making because I've answered these questions, or because other people are kind of directing me to this. So like, the thesis is like, this is the purpose of this work. The purpose of this work is to describe whatever. And then, your research questions will be secondary into that. Other questions that sometimes researchers are intrigued by, but no one else in the research community? Yes, that would be all of my research. Does it make the question not important? I ask myself this question every day. Like, wow, maybe I'm just asking questions that nobody cares about. But like, then you see like microplastics, like it's kind of hard to find funding, like anybody that wants to fund microplastics research, but then you see all these news reports come out. It's like, well, obviously the public cares, even though like people don't really want to fund my research. So, I mean, I say that it does not make the research not important. And if you are in this boat where you're like, oh, please come talk to me because I can commiserate and we can develop some strategies together. But what's the most difficult research question you thought to answer? What made it difficult? How did you come through this difficult question? How did you keep going and was it worth it? Well, the most difficult research question I ever had was, and it's one that we're working on right now, is for the US ski team. We're just developing, like the ski industry has not been touched by materials engineering or not much science. And so there is not really like a definitive answer for what contributes, like what are the material properties that contribute to ski glide performance. So we know that waxes somehow make your skis go faster, but we don't know why. Nobody knows why. Nobody in the entire world knows why. Even if they tell you that they know, the answer is they don't know why. So you just kind of keep going. You're just like, okay, well, we wrapped I've been working on this since 2016, honestly. But so like you kind of have these questions, you keep adding more questions. You're like, okay, well, let's kind of pivot a little bit to kind of understand more. But I would say it's always worth it. I cannot believe how much I know about ski wax and ski glide performance and the physics of all of it. And I'm really happy about, like, that I know all this stuff, but I wouldn't have reached this point if it was so difficult to find the answer to my research question. So I would say it's okay if you have difficult research questions because the learning process is going to be amazing and you're going to come out at the other end and be like, wow, I feel so excited about that now. Or maybe you'll hate it and never want to talk about it again. But anyway. So just in summary, understand the significance, develop techniques, gain the tools for developing questions and relate them to the scope and objectives of your project. And so that's all that I have of this. I would like to open it up to Q&A. All right, so what questions do you have? And I have workshop on here because if you want to workshop some of your ideas, I think that would be this would be a great opportunity to do that.
We have one question. How do you navigate an already heavily researched topic and make it your own?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that the majority of people are in that boat. Like that's probably the most common boat that a lot of people are doing that. So, you go to conferences and, you hear people giving presentations that are almost, they're not quite identical to yours, but they're really trying to solve the same problem. So I was doing something on reproductive health last week in Orlando, talking about materials and how they affect gamete cells. And the presentation right before me was a guy talking about IVF being ineffective because of a different factor. I said it was ineffective because of the materials that are used. So I would think that if you read the papers that they're writing, nobody's research is identical. Everybody brings a different bias and a different angle into the research question. And so if it is something that a lot of people are working on, it means a lot of people care about it. And so it means that you'll have, really good opportunities to kind of consolidate what they're working on, but it's pretty easy to find where the holes are in the research. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's probably the way that I would answer it.
There is a question from Tiffany. How do you mitigate the feeling of competition with other researchers who are researching very similar topics to your own?
Okay, so how do you mitigate competition?
With other researchers who are researching very similar topics to your own?
I think that's a good question too. And I think you can make them your collaborators. Honestly, I think that would be, it's a great collegial thing to do. And you can kind of both nerd out about it and say, wow, this is something that we're both excited about. We both bring a different set of skills because your skills will never be the exact same as anybody else's. So you can kind of bring those, you don't have to collaborate with them, but I would say I think it's more important to be collegial with these people than it is to form a competition because you're going to be in the same fields. And I don't think you want to have hard feelings with people in your fields, but hopefully that answers your question.
And I think you may have already covered this, so I'm sorry if you have, but
Okay.
for a research project involving several components, is it better to have one overarching question or argument or one for each part?
That depends on what the scope of your project is. So I love the idea of having one research question for each of them, but like I'm writing a 5-year NIH grant right now. I probably have 5 research questions, all kind of like, granular, like, okay, like here are the different parts of this, but that's okay in a 5-year research grant. If you're looking at a 16-week UROP project, I think that you probably need to either select just one of the granular questions or two maybe to work on for your UROC project, or step it up just a tiny, step it out just a tiny bit and say, okay, here's like more of an overarching thing that I would like to do, and here are some specific things that I'm going to do that I think will answer this question.
Yeah, I think you covered this, but they said, how do you make a solid research question? Is it okay to change your question as you continue to research?
Yeah, I think that changing your research question is totally fine. I mean, I have my students do this sometimes. Like I say, okay, we're going to start a project. We're going to ask, you figure out the research questions you want to ask, but let's use these methods to see what kind of data we get. But then all of a sudden, as they get data, like, well, we were trying to answer this, but we discovered this interesting thing over here. So this is my lab class. So when we hit the lab report, sometimes they've just modified their research questions and their hypotheses in a way that at least the data that they have at least can answer those questions, because many times the data that they get doesn't answer the first set of questions. So I think it's good to adapt and learn as you go through the research project, because it shows that you are learning. So that's what I would say. And maybe people would disagree with me, like, maybe it sounds bad to tailor your research questions to the answers that you got. But maybe what you could say is like, here, we sought to answer these questions. Throughout the process, we learned these other things. We found out about these other limitations, and the data was really pointing us in this direction. So it's totally fine to be transparent about the morphing of these things. I would say it's actually better to be transparent than it is to like just pretend like, okay, well, we just modified our hypothesis and yay, we got it. We got the answer we were looking for. I think I don't think that's very ethical. So I guess there's like a fine line between what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is like, let's try to understand what we've done, and let's make sure that it fits in a certain way that's going, like, the focus and context is going to make sense when we present it to people.
I think this is similar. How do you best manage your current research project that is veering away from the original objective?
Yeah, every single one of my research projects is way different than the research objectives, for sure. So that's okay if that happens.
Thank you, Dr. Bates, for this great presentation. It was very helpful. We want to remind everybody to complete the event evaluation. I'll put the link in the chat again. A reminder that UROP and early exploration scholars must fill this out in order to get credit for attending today. And I just want to remind everybody that the Office of Undergraduate Research, we're in the SIL Center, which is just across the parking lot from the Student Union. We're here Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. Our website is our.utah.edu, and you can email us at our@utah.edu. And you can scan this code to be put on our newsletter list. And thank you again, Dr. Bates. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you.